Your opponent can't even respect the judge, then what are you doing there, to be honest? It's not even a debate at that point, it's just argument.
What you got there? Pan picks? Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Can you get the tight on me? Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
did, but it was late. Oh, you see it on your side? Oh, because you haven't switched it over yet? It's interesting. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our symposium, our 16th annual Reconciliation in America. I'm Mike Pegues, the president of the board of the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation. I want to thank the Tulsa Public Schools, George Washington Carver Middle School, Principal Joy Pernowski, interim principal, the staff, and just a heartfelt thank you for allowing us to use this venue today. And many thanks to all of you for being with us for the last 16 years and being the heart, hands, and feet of reconciliation as we go on this journey together. It is especially important that we are in this place tonight to discuss the issues that Dr. Lance Freeman will bring to us later in the program. Because it was Carver Junior High School at the time that was closed in 1971 when the desegregation holding in the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education finally made it to Tulsa. This school was closed, and this closing led to the formation of the Coalition for Quality Education that was led by the founding board member of the John Hope Franklin Center and my dad, Julius Pegues. Through the efforts that he led to boycott the Tulsa Public Schools through the use of the coalition's Carver Freedom School, Carver was later reopened in the fall of 1973. We must never forget the efforts to reopen this community educational institution that was led by a man with the conviction of courage and the support of his community. But urban renewal has changed the demographics of Carver's surrounding neighborhood by largely eliminating the significant black community that once thrived in this area. Studying urban planning policies and topics such as housing, urban development, and the socio-economic dynamics of cities will help us understand better how such factors impact urban population, communities, and gentrification. So I welcome and look forward to Dr. Lance Freeman's discussion, as I know all of you do. But before we get started, I want to thank you all again for attending the symposium and for partnering with us, but I also want to thank our sponsors, the Julius and Wynette Pegues Family Foundation, Ruth Nelson Family Foundation, Williams Company, Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation, GKFF, or George Kaiser Family Foundation, Henry and Ann Zarrow Foundation, John W. and Christy Gibson, Phillips Theological Seminary, yours truly, and my wife, Sonia Pegues. And I will now turn the mic over to Kristen Ortel to guide us through the rest of this evening's program. Thank you and welcome.
Good evening. I'm Kristen Ortel, and I'm the symposium chair this year. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Dr. Lance Freeman, I'll be introducing him, and afterwards, after his talk, Dr. Dwayne Dickens from TCC Tulsa will facilitate our dialogue session together, after which we'll have a book signing just right outside. Magic City Books is located there, so be sure to visit if you haven't already purchased these books. We will have a QR code for your many questions as well as your feedback following the lecture. So please, as you're listening to the lecture and considering some questions, feel free to use that QR code to pose them and so that our speaker can consider them. We have with us tonight an important presentation. Assistant coach of the Union High School Forensic Society, Chaz Stevens, and his students, Kiana Leach, Leslie Cardiel, and Coach Chaz Stevens will be up here soon to present a debate. Before the debate occurs on the topic of gentrification, we're going to see a short video that explores the purpose of debate.
The New York City Urban Debate League has helped over 100 New York City schools get access to debate training for students. Tonight, we hear from two middle school students who participate in the league with their brief but spectacular takes on debate and democracy.
To have a good debate, you need to stay calm and prepare.
Respect is a huge factor in debate because if you don't respect your opponent, you can't even respect the judge, then what are you doing there, to be honest? It's not even a debate at that point, it's just an argument. I'm 11 years old, and I go to MS-50 in Brooklyn, New York. I'm currently a 6th grader, and I'm a debater and a basketball player.
I go to PSMS 161 in Harlem, New York. I'm in 7th grade.
I've been doing debate for 3 to 4 years now. Well, it all started in 3rd grade, where there was this new program happening in my elementary school, and I was quite eager to try it out. And then there we learned how to debate, and now here I am.
Should the United States federal government ban TikTok?
TikTok should be banned due to amid concerns that their partner company would give users information, data, such as browser history and location, to the Chinese government and push propaganda.
I think we shouldn't ban TikTok because it gives the young people and other people the voice that they deserve. New York City Urban Debate League is just basically a league of debate where different schools and different cultures around New York City and the boroughs, they come together for different tournaments.
It's important to have these programs out because it promotes diversity in all communities.
I love debate because I get to talk. A lot of the time I've had to switch how I usually perceive things.
When somebody asks me a question, I try my best to answer it fully and then come at them with a question that's even harder.
What's the better borough, Manhattan or Brooklyn?
I think the best borough is Manhattan. We have some good arts and culture and entertainment in Manhattan. There's a really good food. Practically almost everywhere there's some kind of train station. So in and out, you can be across the city from an hour to 30 minutes.
I see your point, but I believe Brooklyn has also a lot of culture of mostly mixed communities, like Dominican and Black and Jewish all in one community. We have a lot of diversity. One of the most important things about debating is being yourself, because if you're not yourself, then who are you? You have to be confident in your abilities and what you can do as a person. If you're confident in yourself and your abilities, you can do anything you want.
Debate is important for the real world because it would allow you to understand others' perspectives. Sometimes looking at the other person's perspective can change your own. If people could understand the other perspective, then it would make it much easier to do things.
To be honest, if you win or you lose, it's still winning at the end of the day because you're learning something, trying your best, being excellent in your own way, and just pushing through.
My name is Francis.
My name is Eric. And this is my brief but spectacular take on debate and democracy. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
The New York City...
Welcome Kiana and Leslie and their coach Chaz.
Hello? Oh, I'll wait for them to get up here. Hello, my name is Chaz Stevens. I'm the assistant coach at Union High School, head coach by Racinda Spatz. These are two of my best, also favorite debaters, Leslie Cardiel and Kiana Leach. Both of them have been under my tenure as a coach since 8th grade, but they've started in debate. Leslie started in 5th grade. Kiana, I believe, started in 7th grade. So you're watching some real pros here. They started a lot younger than when I started, and I'm really excited to have them here today, and thank you all so much for having us. As mentioned before, our topic is about gentrification. One side will present the positives of it, the other side will present the negatives. So we always in debate start off with the pro side and then switch to our negative side. So our pro speaker is Leslie Cardiel.
Thank you. Gentrification can be defined as the process whereby the character of a poor urban area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing, and attracting new businesses, typically displacing current inhabitants in the process. In simple terms, it pretty much means that the rich takes the homes of the poor and kicks them out. At least that's how many people view it. The reality is that the issue of gentrification is much more complex, and it presents a myriad of benefits along with detrimental harms. Here, we must ask ourselves whether the cost of gentrification and the displacement it leads to are worth the benefits. Well, we must first look at the benefits of gentrification. One benefit of gentrification is that it's often linked to a decrease in crime rates. Neighborhood gentrification in Buffalo between 2011 and 2019 was associated with a decrease in property crime independent of a general decrease in similar crime citywide during those same years. And according to a University at Buffalo study, according to a 2017 study by MIT researchers, crime dropped 16% after the end of rent-controlled properties and subsequent rise of gentrification in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There are concerns that this decrease in crime is actually a result of the nationwide decrease in crime throughout the years, but there is significant evidence showing that much of this decrease in crime is linked to gentrification. And one reason as to why gentrification may lead to lowered crime rates is that as wealthier individuals and large corporations move into lower income or rural areas, investing in public safety becomes more common and more prioritized, which leads to increased safety around the area in general. Second, gentrification can allow the differing worlds of lower income and wealthier communities to collide, which may be the first step to addressing the distinct issues lower income communities face. Before gentrification, we can see a clear separation between neighborhoods that are lower income and wealthier neighborhoods. Lower income families are relegated to run-down areas with cracked sidewalks and crumbling schools, while wealthier families get to experience high-end stores and pristine playgrounds for their kids. This separation of socioeconomic classes is a form of segregation, and segregating neighborhoods does not get rid of these sentiments or the harms they cause it. It simply hides them. There's also the issue that more often than not, those being affected by the segregation of socioeconomic classes are also people of color. Despite the valid fear of gentrification disproportionately harming lower income people and therefore people of color, the reality is that these harms are common regardless of whether we gentrify neighborhoods or not. Issues that may come from gentrification include displacement, police action against people of color, lack of investment, predatory landlords, but all of these are prevalent in the socioeconomically segregated neighborhoods as well, arguably even more so due to racism and a lack of enforcement around these areas. Gentrification can serve as the interrogation that we desperately need to address our government's unjust treatment of lower-income communities. Lastly, the whole reason for why it happens in general is that gentrification can lead to economic prosperity. First, as revitalization occurs and more wealthy businesses grow in these areas, property values go up. Although it is harmful for those who cannot afford to continue renting or living in an area, it is extremely beneficial for those that can, as their investments finally pay off. Increased property values then leads to increased wealth for those that continue to live in the area. Second, as gentrification continues to attract new businesses and people, more job opportunities are created. As a myriad of job opportunities appear, people in the area have greater chances of acquiring a quality job, and unemployment rates decrease in that area. Wealthier businesses often have the ability to pay their employees better as well, meaning people can get higher wages. Lastly, as gentrification occurs, the development of services in the area grow as well. For example, what was once an understaffed hospital, a dirty park, or a rundown school can be repaired thanks to increased value in the area and be transformed into quality services for those living in the gentrified area. Similar to the point that gentrification decreases crime rates because of increased investment in gentrified areas, increased investment also serves to simply foster the quality of life in areas that were once plagued by struggles. The reality is that gentrification has many detrimental harms, such as displacement of people that used to live there, of the original residents of these areas. But when we put these harms into context, we can clearly see that there are also benefits as well, and we must not overlook them when we look at this issue of gentrification. Thank you.
All right, and now to present the negative side of gentrification is my senior, Kiana Lynch.
Hello, hope everyone's doing okay. Gentrification refers to the process of urban renewal that often displaces low-income residents as wealthier individuals move into a neighborhood, while proponents argue that it revitalizes areas and boosts economic development. The negative consequences for existing communities are profound and often overlooked. We can move on to my first point, that is, it causes the displacement of residents. Gentrification often leads to the displacement of long-standing residents that can no longer afford the rising rents and property taxes. A study done by the Urban Institute found that in several U.S. cities, neighborhoods experiencing gentrification saw a significant increase in housing costs. For instance, in Washington, D.C., neighborhoods such as Shaw have seen rents increase by over 65% since 2000. As affluent newcomers move in, the demand for housing increases, driving up prices dramatically. For many low-income families, this can mean that they are forced to leave their homes, neighborhoods, and social networks. According to the John Center of Housing Studies at Harvard University, many families face upheaval due to skyrocketing rents, forcing them to move to less desirable and inadequately serviced areas. This increases a rate of people being harmed or simply being damaged mentally within our areas and communities. So we can see a great stark harm and great negative impact there. And even as it may bring about a reversal in the decline of a city, displacement caused by gentrification can force prior residents into poorer and unsafe areas with limited access to affordable housing, healthy food choices, and social networks. In turn, this triggers an increased stress level and decreased mental health. According to the CDC, vulnerable segments of the population are at an increased risk for negative health effects of gentrification, such as a shorter life expectancy and an increased risk of cancer, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Gentrification leads to the exclusion of the original residents, particularly people of color, and a lack of government support for low-income housing aid, for example. As a well-weakened social community and community ties. And we can move on to my second point, which is a loss of cultural identity. Loss of cultural identity can lead to feelings of isolation, disconnection, and even mental health issues, as it can undermine a person's sense of belonging and purpose within their own community and heritage. Gentrification often erases the unique cultural and social fabric of a neighborhood. Longtime residents usually contribute to a vibrant community with established traditions, businesses, and social connections. A great example is a grocery store may replace the traditional and unique food establishments of the original residents. Also, culture and character research by the Institute for Policy Studies highlights that neighborhoods like Brooklyn, Bedford, Sudivant have seen significant cultural shifts as beloved local venues close while upscale options emerge. As new residents and businesses move in, the original culture often gets commodified or lost entirely. Local shops and restaurants can reflect the history and identity of the community. May be replaced by chain stores and upscale dining options that cater to wealthier demographics. A report by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition emphasizes the cultural changes that often go with gentrification, adding pressures on longtime residents to commodify new social norms and values, leading to feelings of alienation. This phenomenon erases the historical and social essence of these neighborhoods. The deconstruction of local culture can foster resentment among longtime residents. According to a survey conducted in San Francisco, 64% of longtime residents felt that gentrification had made their neighborhoods less inviting and less reflective of their culture. Their own homes were no longer their homes. And we can see that this cultural erasure can lead to feelings of alienation and resentment among longtime residents who feel like their homes no longer belong to them. And finally, my last point, economic inequality. Gentrification can worsen economic inequality within communities. As wealthier individuals move into a neighborhood, they may receive help from improved infrastructure, services, and amenities, while the existing residents are left behind or pushed out entirely. The Economic Policy Institute states that gentrified neighborhoods often see substantial investments leading to improved infrastructure and services for newcomers, while leaving existing residents marginalized. This increased property value and taxes can lead to reduction in affordable housing options, making it increasingly difficult for low-income individuals to find stable housing. This disparity in housing options worsens the affordability gap as affordability simply declines. Research by the National Low Income Housing Coalition shows that in gentrifying areas, the availability of affordable housing units can drop by as much as 50%, creating hardships for low-income families. Moreover, the influx of higher-income individuals individuals often leads to a concentration of wealth and investment in certain areas, creating stark divides between neighborhoods, intensifying economic disparities citywide. A 2019 report from Brookings Institutions highlights how gentrification can lead to greater divides between neighborhoods, intensifying social and economic divides. As wealthier individuals occupy gentrified neighborhoods, the resulting concentration of wealth can drive a wedge between socioeconomic classes, worsening urban inequality. And while we can see that gentrification is often portrayed as unavoidable for urban development, its detrimental effects on existing communities cannot be ignored. This displacement of longtime residents, the erosion of cultural identity, and the deepening of economic equality present significant challenges that require thoughtful intervention. We can see that it is essential to prioritize affordable housing, community services, and the prevention of cultural heritage and the preservation of cultural heritage to ensure that all residents can thrive in their neighborhoods and in their homes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much for having us today. I hope that kind of stirs your all idea pots on what you all think about gentrification and added some new things and maybe cleared up some identities for you. So again, thank you all so much for having us.
That was very impressive. Please keep the University of Tulsa in mind in a few years. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Dr. Lance Freeman is the Penn Integrates Knowledge, or PIC, professor of City and Regional Planning and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Freeman received his PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in City and Regional Planning. He has published a number of articles on issues related to gentrification, urban poverty, housing policy, urban sprawl, the relationship between the built environment and public health, and residential segregation. His books, which will be available for sale and signing after his talk, include There Goes the Hood, Views of Gentrification from the Ground Up by Temple University Press, and A Haven and a Hell, The Ghetto in Black America by Columbia University Press. Prior to beginning his academic career, Professor Freeman worked as a researcher for Mathematica Policy Research, a leading social science research organization in Washington, D.C. Professor Freeman also has professional planning experience working as a city planner for the New York City Housing Authority. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lance Freeman to Tulsa.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm really impressed by the students. I'm not sure I have much to add beyond what they've already said. That was a really good job, really impressive. When I was in high school, I'm not sure I even knew what gentrification was, so I'm impressed. I'm happy to be here and have an opportunity to talk to you all. I'm going to be talking about how communities might think about their historical legacy and how that can inform efforts to revitalize or rejuvenate, or some might say gentrify their neighborhoods, depending on your perspective. This is, I think, a great place for this subject. Greenwood, as you all know, I'm not telling you anything, historically has been sort of an emblem of what black people can achieve. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is how blacks have built up their communities, right? And what were some of the things that occurred that allowed that to happen, and then how we can use that historical legacy to think about our communities today. Okay, so there's a long tradition of black people coming together to build up their communities, right, to do for self. Part of that was out of necessity, right, during the age of Jim Crow and the aftermath of the Civil War. Part of it was driven by the advantages of working in a protected market, during the time of segregation, there were certain advantages of providing services to your neighbors, and to some extent, one had no choice. An early peak or zenith of this was in the early decades of the 20th century during the era of what I'll call the New Negro, right? And so we could think of this as sort of an ideology, but it really represented a new way of thinking as blacks who were born in the aftermath of Reconstruction and slavery, and so had no personal memory of that. They had a new way of looking at the world, right? The so-called old Negro compared his status to the way things were under slavery, right? But people are now coming of age around the turn of the last century where they're comparing their status to other citizens, right? And so they're demanding their due. They want to be treated as full citizens. When that doesn't happen, they start to think about how can we advance ourselves? How can we advance the race? And so that was the New Negro movement. And what happened as a result of that, we start to see the first stages of the Great Migration, blacks moving out of the agrarian South, right, to take advantage of opportunities in industry and in cities and creating their own communities. A gentleman by the name of Jesse Binga kind of encapsulates this idea. He arrives in Chicago in the first decades of the 20th century, virtually penniless, but he would go on to create a real estate and financial empire serving his fellow black residents. What he did was he acquired properties from whites, redeveloped them, engaged in what we might now call being a real estate speculator or flipper, and opened up that housing to other African Americans. He also opened up a bank and a food factory as well. So what he was doing was, while you probably have learned, we've heard about the Great Migration and how that led to the creation of ghettos in the urban North, but the point I'm making here is that blacks had some agency in this process, right? He was an agent in terms of carving out places for black people to live and creating services for them as well. We can also look at Harlem, where a similar dynamic played out. A realtor by the name of Philip A. Payton acquired properties in Harlem from white landlords, flipped the properties after renovating them, and opened them up to African Americans. And indeed, that is how Harlem went on to become a predominantly black community. What's also interesting about the way he did it, if you can see from this slide, he used this company as a way for African Americans to financially invest in acquiring real estate to build up the community. So this is another example of how blacks came together to build up their communities. And we see this also in the arts as well. This is at the time of what would later be called the Negro or the Harlem Renaissance. This is an artistic movement where blacks aim to show to the world that we were humans too. We can create art just as good as any other people as well. And so this sentiment expressed itself in terms of art, it expressed itself in terms of self-pride, as evidenced by Marcus Garvey and the United Negro Improvement Association. And so you have you had a cultural flowering, not only in Harlem, although it's called the Harlem Renaissance, and that was sort of a mecca, but around the country in black communities. You had an artistic movement that sought to reflect this sort of new Negro ideology. We can also think about its manifestation in the black press. The black press was instrumental in serving as an organ for black people in general. And this was particularly important in parts of the South, where a free press that could speak the truth about racial issues in particular was a risky endeavor. And so by creating the black press, black people were able to advocate for themselves, to speak on behalf of those who may have remained behind in the South where they could no longer express those types of ideas. And finally, we also see a manifestation of this in terms of politics. For the first time since the Reconstruction era, with blacks migrating to cities and forming their own communities, they're able to elect black representatives who, in addition to representing their local communities, also played the crucial and important role of representing blacks who were disenfranchised in other communities. So this is what I refer to as this new Negro movement. This is the period of the first decades of the 20th century. This is kind of a zenith, at least in the years after the Civil War, where black people are coming together to form communities and advance their interests. I'm going to fast forward a few decades now to another era when blacks again start to come together and think about improvement by building on their own communities. The ideology here is what is sometimes referred to as the Black Power movement, right? So this is a period in the wake or in the immediate heels of the Civil Rights Movement. This is at a time when many former African and Asian colonies are escaping the yoke of their European masters, right? Where the ideologies of anti-colonialists like Frantz Fanon are influencing the local blacks thinking about how to approach the black condition in America. And so we see this ideology of black power arise to think about what is the status of blacks in America and how can we go about improving it. And what black power really meant was more control over black institutions, right? And black institutions that serve the needs and interests of the black community, right? And there was a thinking that this needs to happen in a particular place, right? And so black neighborhoods were instrumental in allowing black people to put into practice some of the ideas that we associate with black power, right? So ideas about acquiring a homeland, a physical space, building a black community, black politics. It's within these communities where black power is able to manifest itself, right? And so for the first time, we start to see large numbers of black people elected to political office. We start to see the first mayors being elected of major cities, right? We also start to see an artistic movement or the black arts movement arising at this time. And here, art is being used as an instrument to educate and uplift the masses of black people. Okay? So I just briefly described two periods, the sort of new Negro era of the early 20th century and the Black Power era of the 1960s and 1970s. These are time periods where blacks kind of looked inwards and thought about how can we improve our condition relative to the rest of the country. And so I'd like to think about what lessons can we take away from that for thinking about today. I think both of these periods highlight the importance of black agency, right? Both of these periods also came about in part due to necessity. There was a practical component, a focus on economic development and political development or electoral strategies. And finally, there was a sort of ideological underpinning, right, that sort of served as a catalyst for the way people acted, right? In the first decades of the 20th century, this sort of new Negro movement, and then in the middle and latter decades of the 20th century, the 1960s, 1970s, the Black Power ideology. So both of them kind of infused the way people thought about their communities and how they could approach improving those communities in those time periods. Okay, so what about today? Black communities around the country have been experiencing substantial change. And one of the biggest changes that we perhaps don't confront or don't discuss enough or as much as we should is the loss of population. So many black neighborhoods are losing significant numbers of people. And perhaps most alarming, it tends to be younger adults, younger black adults, that are among the first that are leaving these communities. And why do I mention that? Well, it's the young people. Young people are the future. They're the ones that are going to create the future of these communities. So as we think about how to improve or rejuvenate black communities, we want to keep in mind what the current headwinds are. And one is that black communities are shrinking. Some of that is the result of more opportunities. So that's a good thing compared to certainly the early decades of the 20th century or the middle of the 20th century. Black people have more options in terms of choosing where they want to live and where they're allowed to live. So that part is a good thing. That's a positive. But at the same time, many black people are also looking at these communities and thinking that's not a place of opportunity. And as the two young ladies discuss, some of them are being pushed out or displaced due to other factors as well. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So how can we think about rejuvenating black communities? So I'm going to pivot to talking about and thinking about discussing with you all how we can build on a historical past and think about using that to rejuvenate and improve communities today. So one of the things I have found in my research is that many younger blacks look at the past, look at the history that I just briefly described to you, right, and appreciate black communities, right? So you do have many younger blacks that are leaving, yet at the same time, there is some sentiment for wanting to live within these communities, for wanting to give back to these communities, for a certain nostalgia for black communities the way they were. And just in my visiting Tulsa, this is my first time coming to Tulsa, and Vanessa being so kind as to show me around, I could myself sort of feel as she was describing the way Tulsa was, I can kind of feel that nostalgia myself and think about, wow, what the community was like and what perhaps it can be. And you'll see many blacks will talk about these places as a former homeland, somewhere that they could go and find and build on their identity. And I think it's that sentiment that we want to tap as we think about how to rejuvenate and revitalize these communities, right? So these communities have a rich history to improve and grow in the future. We need young people, right? They're the raw material that we need to strengthen our communities. And I think there is a sentiment that exists that can be built upon to rebuild and rejuvenate these communities, okay? So I'll talk about one idea, one way, and some of this you all will be familiar with. I've heard discussions about a historic district where in Tulsa. So I'll talk about how we might think about that and share with you an example in a few minutes of how this has played out in one community. Okay? So the idea is both heritage conservation and preservation. Heritage conservation is in a sort of an intentional action, right? It's much of what this organization is engaged in, right? Protecting and elevating culturally significant markers to kind of create an identity for a space, to say this is an important space, right? For historical reasons. At the same time, preservation is focusing more on the physical buildings that are there, right? To preserve the neighborhood, to preserve the community. Right? So we're preserving the physical space and at the same time signifying that this is of significance. This has important historical significance. Okay? And so by preserving the historical legacy of a place, we can augment the historical memory, foster a sense of place, and that can serve as a catalyst for further rejuvenation of the community. So I'll share with you an example of Harlem. That's a neighborhood I know I'm familiar with. I lived in Harlem. Both of my parents are from Harlem. In fact, that's where they met. And so you could say, if not for Harlem, I wouldn't be here, literally. So I'll share with you an example of Harlem. It's probably a neighborhood that you have heard of. Of course, it's famous because it was the mecca of the Harlem Renaissance in the early decades of the 20th century. That's kind of how it became famous and so well known during that time period. It had its historic importance in the early decades of the 20th century. However, by the 1970s, the community had fallen on very hard times. It lost about half of its population in the few decades after 1950. As more African Americans became upwardly mobile, they were able to move to the outer boroughs of New York City or to the suburbs, and blacks stopped coming to Harlem. They stopped seeing it as a place to go for opportunity. Property abandonment was widespread. There was a heroin epidemic that racked the community. In fact, my own father and several of my uncles were ensnared in this drug epidemic. So the community had become, by the 1970s, one of the poorest neighborhoods in New York City and perhaps in the country. There was rampant crime. It had really fallen on hard times. But not everyone left. Right? Many people remained in the community. And one of the things that they did was to think about preserving Harlem as a place, and not just a physical place, but a place that would be important, continue to be important for black people. And I think part of it, I'll share some of the things that were done that I think enabled them to achieve some success, was to invest in some of the important cultural resources that existed in the community. Okay? So the Schomburg Center is a library that was founded during the period of the Harlem Renaissance by a Puerto Rican historian, and it went on to become one of the most important repositories of black literature and materials for black historical research on the black experience in the country, if not the world. Okay? And so that was something that was preserved and maintained and subsequently was renovated in the latter decades of the 20th century. Also, the Studio Museum of Harlem, which was founded during the 1960s as part of the Black Arts movement, that too was preserved and renovated more recently. So this is an image of how it looks today after it has been recently renovated. That too was maintained, right? And there are other cultural institutions we can point to as well. But I think what this did is it sent a signal to people that Harlem, however it changes, it's going to remain an important cultural mecca for black people, right? Despite what changes that will happen. These institutions and others kind of serve as an anchor for the community, sending a signal that this is some place that has important cultural significance for black people in America. Harlem also, as many of you are attempting to do here, adopted several historic districts. I think this served a couple of purposes. One, again, it's preserving the historical legacy of the community. This is a picture of a community known as Strivers Row, which is a relatively affluent black community during this era of the Harlem Renaissance. And by preserving the community using a historic district, they were able to remain or maintain the physical attractiveness of the neighborhood. I think this also has the advantage of drawing in some people of means and resources to invest in the community because the housing is relatively attractive. And so people were drawn to the community. And so this could also help to serve as an anchor for the surrounding community. So this is just one example of a historic district where they're preserving the physical buildings, which sort of serve to complement the preservation and maintenance and investment in the cultural institutions that I was just talking about a few moments ago. And so you can see with this investment in the historical legacy that this even has spread to private developers who, when building housing in Harlem, now use its historical legacy as a selling point for their product. So these buildings that they're building could literally be anywhere and called anything, but they know Harlem now has a certain cachet. It's a center for black culture. There's a rich history here. And so this could be used, and this is indeed what they're doing. They're using this to market the community, to draw people to the buildings that they're developing, okay? And so with this, we see a neighborhood that is changing, has changed over time. One where abandonment was widespread, where there was a drug epidemic, to one where developers are building luxury housing and marketing it to people who are eager and want to live in and around this rich culture. Okay? So that also raises the question, and this sort of piggybacks on what the students just talked about. That sounds great, or maybe not so great, but is this just gentrification, right? So if we build buildings like this, are we just inviting rich people to come into the neighborhood and displace all of the black folks? Okay, and I think that is a real risk. Harlem, presenting this to you now, we do have the advantage that Harlem has been experiencing some gentrification for probably, we could say, 30, 35 years. So we can see kind of what has happened. How has this impacted the community? I'm not going to go into every detail, but I'll share what I think are some salient data points that can help us evaluate what has happened and maybe help contribute to the debate that the two students had before me. So this chart shows how Harlem has changed demographically in the past 20 years, right? And so the orange bar represents the number of blacks in the left panel, and the percentage of the community that is black in the right panel. The same for Asians, Hispanics, and whites. And so what the chart shows is that from 2000 to 2020, the black population has declined. Right? It's lost about 20,000 out of 80,000 blacks. So a significant loss. On the other hand, I guess the two students were debating, the pro would say, but there's still blacks are the plurality of the neighborhood. And the neighborhood is becoming more diverse, right? So the second largest group now is the Hispanic population. Okay? The white population is increasing substantially. It goes from 2% to 14%. But now Harlem is a more diverse community, right? So we can take that and make of it what we will, right? But what's happening is that the neighborhood has become more diverse, okay? We can also look at changes in the income distribution, all right? So this chart shows the proportion of people living in different income ranges, all the way from less than $20,000 a year, that's declined, but still substantial, still about a fifth of the population income over $20,000 a year, all the way up to households making more than $250,000 a year, where you see there's been a significant increase. So one of the students mentioned that gentrification leads to more income inequality, and this chart suggests that's true. Is that a good thing or not is, open for debate. We have more rich and poor people living together in Harlem now than we did 20 years ago, okay? But it also suggests that even with substantial gentrification, there's still a lot of poor people who live in Harlem. And the next chart, I think, kind of highlights this point as well. So these bars represent the poverty rate in various New York City neighborhoods. Harlem is the blue bar. The dashed horizontal line is the citywide poverty rate. So we can see Harlem is still poorer than the vast majority of neighborhoods in New York City, and it's poorer than the city as a whole. So what does that mean? You know, I think it depends on your vantage point. You could say there's less black people living in Harlem, there's less poor people living in Harlem. That would be consistent with, I guess, the con side of gentrification. At the same time, it's still the home for many poor people and many black people as well. That would be the pro side, okay? And you know, we could talk about that more during the Q&A, but that's sort of the basic facts of what has happened in Harlem in the aftermath of several decades of gentrification. And I would also note that as a whole, the neighborhood has gained more population. Okay? So even as some poor people are leaving, more people are coming into the neighborhood. Okay? So what do people say? One of the things I found in doing research on gentrification, people talk about displacement, but there's also there's a physical displacement and sort of a figurative displacement, right? So this chart or this image captures what someone said to me when I was asking them about how gentrification was impacting them, and they you know, said they were kind of ambivalent, but they said one of the things that I thought was salient, how we thought that, you know, as the neighborhood was changing, people were coming into the neighborhood, and things that they used to do, right? They might sit on the stoop and drink a beer. They couldn't do that anymore. The police would come and say, you know, you can't consume alcohol outside. But they observed that people were sitting outside drinking. They just happened to be sitting in front of a restaurant, right? And so what's really the difference? You're sitting outside one way or the other, right? But what was different, people were coming into the neighborhood and enforcing a new set of norms, a new set of standards, right? I'll share with you another example in Harlem. There was a park where people would gather every Sunday morning to drum. It became a tradition starting in the 1970s, okay? As the neighborhood gentrified and new condo developments were opening around the park, some people started to complain that they were making too much noise. Okay? And again, the police were contacted to come in and stop the noise, right? And again, the conflict, you know, neighbors have conflicts all the time, but I think what this highlighted, right, was the people, we'll call them the gentry, were using the police to enforce their notion of what is acceptable in the neighborhood, right? So neighbors can have conflict and disagree. That's to be expected, but I think it was the practice of using external forces in the form of the police to enforce one particular view about how the neighborhood, how people in the neighborhood should behave. There was a sort of a positive ending in the sense that people in the community were able to come together and reach some common ground. But the fact that the police were involved at all, I think, is part of this idea and why people feel like they're being pushed out of their community, even if they're not being physically displaced. They still feel like their home no longer belongs to them. And so I do think that is a real risk. And so I think Harlem did have some success in terms of preserving its identity. If you were to visit Harlem today, it would still come across as a predominantly a black place, not just in terms of the number of people, but just in terms of the vibe. And so I think it has preserved its identity. It has been successful in preserving its physical, built environment, inculcating a sense of pride of place. But as I suggested, tensions still exist, and some people, have been displaced. Right? It doesn't appear that, certainly not everyone is being displaced, but there has been some displacement, both literally and figuratively. And I think that's something we can consider. So what are some of the lessons that we can take away from this in thinking about other places? So in some ways, obviously New York City is a really big city and it's unique in that regard. New York City also has rent regulation, which most cities don't have, which helps people to remain in their apartments because rents, although they can increase, they only increase by a certain amount every year. Harlem also has a lot of public housing that it has preserved from the 20th century, and again, many cities are tearing down their public housing and replacing it with mixed income housing. But that also, in the case of Harlem, had the advantage of preserving one stock of affordable housing for people. So the combination of rent regulation and public housing, I think, served Harlem well as it experienced gentrification. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that other communities can do that can try to help people to remain in their communities. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we might think about both. Oh, okay, sorry. Maybe I'll just hold it. Okay. Yeah, that's a lot better, right? Sorry about that. So I was saying, yeah, there are other things that other communities can do in spite of the fact that they might not have rent regulation or public housing, right? So, well, what can we do? What can other cities think about in terms of affordable housing? So I also do a lot of work studying affordable housing issues, and I sort of thought about what types of affordable housing might work in the context of gentrification. I think one idea is inclusionary zoning, and this works best in a place where housing prices are increasing rapidly and new development is occurring. The underlying rationale is that by building new housing and allowing the developer to build at a slightly higher density, the developer earns a bigger profit, but at least some of that profit would go to providing affordable housing. Okay, so it has the potential in a place where housing prices are increasing rapidly, where developers are coming in and want to build more housing. If we can take advantage of that increased interest in building there and using that to fund affordable housing, you can see new housing itself, which is oftentimes feared as a catalyst for gentrification, also being a catalyst for affordable housing. Okay? The low-income housing tax credit is another tool that could potentially be used in gentrifying neighborhoods. For those of you not familiar with the program, the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC as it's sometimes called, is funded by the federal government through the IRS, and states decide where they're going to target their affordable housing through the tax credit program. So currently in Oklahoma, difficult to develop areas, which could be places with high cost of land, qualified census tracts, which tend to be very low income areas, and high opportunity areas are places that the state of Oklahoma incentivizes the use of affordable housing tax credits. So with gentrification, we could also think about targeting neighborhoods that are experiencing a rapid increase in their housing prices, neighborhoods that seem to be experiencing gentrification, as places where we want developers to use the tax credit, right? The state can tailor how it decides to use its tax credits in a way so that in addition to targeting these neighborhoods, we target those neighborhoods that seem to be especially vulnerable to gentrification. Finally, an idea I have floated, although I have not seen it used in practice, is thinking about using something called tax increment financing to fund affordable housing. So typically, tax increment financing, or TIFs, are used to fund infrastructure. Here in Tulsa, it appears that it has been used in several instances for the development of mixed uses in the downtown area. And so in many ways, Oklahoma is more progressive than many other states, because what I've seen in most other states, it's been solely used for infrastructure. But what about if we think about using tax increment financing in gentrifying neighborhoods as a way of generating resources to build affordable housing? If we're investing in a community and we anticipate the property values will subsequently increase, why can't we set aside at least some of the increase in property taxes to fund affordable housing? Okay? So the idea, again, as in the case of inclusionary zoning, is to try to take advantage of the increased interest and investment in that neighborhood and use some of that increase to fund affordable housing. And so ideally, this would help people who live in the community to remain there, and just as importantly, help low-income households who want to move in the community to be able to do that as well. There's one thing sometimes we don't remember is that neighborhoods are dynamic. They're constantly changing, right? People are constantly leaving, moving in and moving out. And so if we're interested in keeping the neighborhood accessible to a wide range of people, we have to be able to not only help people who live there remain there, but to help others to be able to move in the community as well. Okay. All right. So I think history can be used to attract tourists. It can attract investment and additional revenue. And through that, we can see an increase in housing and property values. And as many would say, that could just lead to gentrification. However, we don't just have to stand idly by. There are things that we can think about doing that could help people to remain in the community, right? And that could be through inclusionary zoning, through LIHTC, as I mentioned, the low-income housing tax credit, or tax increment financing, okay? But what about the sort of cynicism that many people have expressed, right? So this is the last point I'll address, right? So the idea that people, regardless of even if they are able to stay in the community, they feel like the community no longer belongs to them. They no longer feel like it's their home. How can we address that? And in some ways that is more challenging, but I think there are a couple of things that we can think about. And so I think one of the most important things, and I'm happy to see a lot of you all are doing and engaged in this work here in Tulsa, is mobilizing the community first. So it's the first step, even before, hopefully before gentrification is occurring. Thinking about what does the community envision for themselves, right? What do they want to see in the future of their community, right? And how can they be involved in making it happen, right? I think that is perhaps one of the most important steps. Without that, I think what can often happen is people get the sense that the neighborhood change is something that's being imposed on them, right? That they're bystanders in this process that is changing their very home. So I think involving people in the community, even before drawing up any particular plans or focusing on any particular project. Engaging the community is a crucial first step, because I think by doing that, people have more of a sense of control, more of a sense of power, and they feel like they have a say in what's happening to their community. Okay? The second point I'll mention is the idea of institutionalizing equity. And I realize the term equity is kind of fallen out of favor, but that's what has been called, and I'll still advocate for it. We could, if you want to call it something else, that's fine. But I think the idea is to put it into practice. So I was involved in New York in the adoption of an ordinance, a change in the planning code that was designed to address some of the issues that I have just discussed. Most concretely, what they did was say, if a developer is going to engage or undertake a project that requires significant city action, so this means the city is being asked to rezone a property, or the city is being asked to use eminent domain, or the city is being asked to provide a tax break, right? So the developer is asking the city for something. It falls upon the developer to show how is this going to impact different people in the community. Is it going to contribute to displacement? Is it going to increase housing prices? Is it going to disproportionately impact people of a particular demographic or socioeconomic status? Okay? And so the idea is that before undertaking a major project, policymakers would be presented with the information to know, oh, this is how it's going to affect my constituents, this is who's going to benefit from it, and, hopefully they can act on that information, either by not approving the project or asking the developer to make certain changes. So I think this idea, and this is one that we implemented in a project in Brooklyn, New York that I was involved in, where we had the developer make the case, because the developer asked for a rezoning. So we asked the developer to make the case, how is this project going to affect people in the local community? And we were able to, they were required to provide the data and information that could support claims that this would or would not benefit people in the community. This is, admittedly not a panacea, right? And people can, fudge the numbers or what have you. But what I think what it does do is kind of force an honest assessment, right? Who is this being built for? Who is going to benefit from it? What can you do to make it more inclusive, and so forth? Okay. So I've done some research looking at other cities. Several other cities have adopted a similar practice. Boston, Seattle, Washington, D.C. are a few that come to mind. And the basic approach is, as I described in the case of New York, if there's a substantial proposal that requires the city to do something on behalf of the developer, it falls on the developer then to show how this is going to impact the community. Ideally, the community would have a set of goals for what they want, right? And so the community, too, can then evaluate what's being proposed against what their aims are. And that can start a dialogue with the developer to build something that is seen as more equitable and more inclusive, okay? So just to kind of sum up what I've been talking about, again, the aim is to think about how to rejuvenate many black communities, right? And I mentioned many black communities have fallen on hard times. They've lost a significant amount of their population. They've experienced disinvestment. And so one approach could be to build on the cultural history that many of these communities have. As I suggested, there is a sort of a latent desire among many younger blacks, for example, and whites and people of other races as well, right? To live in a place that has a rich cultural legacy. We can also, assuming we're successful and inviting reinvestment into the community, we can also think about how we can preserve access to the community, both for people who are living there and for people who might want to continue to move in the neighborhood going forward. And we can also think about how we can address the feelings of being pushed out by mobilizing residents and institutionalizing certain practices that ensure equity is a major consideration. And at the end, the hope would be to create a vibrant and inclusive community. And I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions and talk to you about this, what I think is a very important topic.
First task is to figure out how to turn on the microphone. Well, thank you, Dr. Freeman. That was definitely an informative presentation. And so we have about 20 minutes of questions, and so I'll ask a few of them, and then I'll start pulling from the items that you put in your QR codes as well. And so just for grounding the audience, want to think about your background as a city planner and a sociologist. How have those two items influenced the way you approach urban research and policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as was mentioned, I worked as a city planner for the New York City Housing Authority for a few years. And so that experience at that time, we were attempting to build public housing. So we were engaged in planning and developing affordable housing. So that experience really got me interested in thinking about affordable housing and how important it is to the communities, but also the way it's stigmatized as well, right? So we encountered a lot of resistance to building much needed affordable housing because of the sort of stereotype that affordable housing is going to bring down property values, it's going to increase crime, that, the people in affordable housing don't know how to act, and, all the negative stereotypes I'm sure many of you have heard. So I was very interested in, is it true? Why do people think this? Why do they feel so, negatively about such a potentially important resource? And that really got me interested in studying the topic in more detail and actually studying, well, what happens when you build affordable housing in a community? Does it mean that the community property values have to go down and so forth? In the future, I find that it's a much more nuanced relationship and conversation that we need to have about that. But it was that experience working as a city planner got me interested in sort of the sociology of how cities work and how affordable housing fits into that. And just importantly, how we can improve affordable housing. Even if it were true that affordable housing had a negative impact, that doesn't mean that's a given. How can we build better affordable housing so that it can be something that's treasured by people of all classes?
Thank you. There was a slide that you had toward the end about empowering residents. So I'm going to lean into that particular one. And there's a backdrop of, I've already seen one of the questions from someone, and I sort of want to have that as a backdrop as well. Someone did ask, so I'm going to put that out there now, should every community have a city planner? Don't want to answer that at the moment, but I want to answer that through the lens of this, or have that as the lens for this question. If we're empowering residents, you mentioned we need to mobilize the community. So I'm wondering, particularly thinking about areas like Greenwood, areas like North Tulsa, areas that maybe the residents just don't know what to do, or don't have as many people interested in doing something. What are some suggestions based on what you've experienced, what your research says, that could really be helpful in mobilizing communities who we know want to have difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll admit I haven't worked as a community organizer myself, although I have interacted with community organizers, and I'm active in my own community where I live. But I think what tends to be successful is first, identifying a common ground or a common problem or a common challenge. It doesn't have to be something major or overly overwhelming, but something that could bring people together that they're likely to agree on, that you can have some success in achieving a desired end. So that's a sort of a first step of just bringing people together, building on those connections, showing people that they can affect change. And with that first step, people can then start to think about, what are some of the bigger things that are confronting the community? What are some of the bigger things that we would like to accomplish? So I think first is, finding something. It could be something simple, it could even just be like a block party or something. But something simple that will likely bring people together, that people are likely to have a consensus about. You first want to build the bonds, build the connections, get people to know one another, show that you can be effective in achieving some type of change. And then from there, you can start to think about bigger issues, some issues that might be a little bit more divisive, and move forward from that point.
Tim, and I know that we're going to get some questions from these QR codes. I know you all are thinking of them and going to send them in. Leaning even further into that question, I know from your research background, you are extremely, especially as a city planner as well, you've mentioned in the previous question response how you want to show that you're being effective. And often the challenge for a community, especially when trying to coalesce around an issue that matters to them, finding out how to show effectiveness is really difficult for communities that are coming from the grassroots. Can you give some advice on how would you tell a grassroots community that they're getting to know each other, they have a cause that they're interested in, a heritage they're trying to preserve? What would be some key items that would help them show that they're making a difference in well, I'll just stop with that.
Well, you could start by picking something tangible, something that's visible. Communities do things like a neighborhood cleanup or something like that. That's something that is feasible, something that's highly visible. The neighborhood looks better, something that everyone could come together. Those are the types of relatively simple, easy to start, low-hanging fruit, if you will, kind of to start, right? So simply having a neighborhood cleanup obviously is not going to dramatically change someone's life chances, but it does show, hey, we can make the neighborhood look better. It's something that people will likely agree on, and it's something that's achievable. So starting with those types of low-hanging fruit, consensus is easy to achieve. It's something you can easily point to. There used to be, a pile of trash over there. It's no longer there. And that's the sort of thing I think that can inspire some confidence and hopefully bring people together to believe that they can affect change going forward.
Okay, so I'm still waiting for questions. I don't see an additional one. Well, I do. I'll ask this question. How does land ownership affect a community's ability to remain?
Land ownership can be very important, right? Property ownership not only allows someone to remain in the community in most instances because they're not at risk of, say, rent inflation because they own their property, but it also provides people an opportunity to benefit from increases in property values. We sometimes, in the circles I travel with, and I'm sure the same is here too, people talk about the wealth gap, wealth inequality, and one of the biggest drivers of wealth inequalities is differences not only in property ownership, but in the values of those properties. And so owning the land and the property is important both for protecting people, helping them to remain in the community, but also giving them an opportunity to build and accumulate wealth as well. So I would say that would be very important as well. And that's something we could also talk about when we think about gentrification, helping people to acquire property before the neighborhood becomes too expensive and beyond their reach is important, can be an important step. And giving people a sense of ownership in their own community.
Okay. And so I'm going to ask a question based on, you mentioned something in one of your books. I'm not sure if it's I believe it's the one that talks, well, there's a question of when people are, the number of people who actually move or displaced because of gentrification. And you gave some nuanced understanding of that, but there was something about the number of people who move within an area such as that's being gentrified versus the number of people who move out of the area. And you were comparing how those numbers, you had a comparison of those numbers. Could you, I want to make sure, does that make sense to you?
It does.
Okay. Could you talk about what that comparison suggested from your book? Because we didn't talk about it today, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to, I was probably trying to unpack the notion of displacement and people moving in and out of the neighborhood. And I think I alluded to this a few moments ago. When we think about a neighborhood and we think about it, people being displaced or the neighborhood changing, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the neighborhoods are always changing, right? Any neighborhood, if you went back 20 years ago, the people would likely be somewhat different. Some of the people would be the same, but many people will have left, perhaps would have died. There could be people who were born and people who moved in. So you have this dynamism that characterizes all neighborhoods. When we say the neighborhood is changing, many times what we're saying is that the type of people coming in are different from the people who are leaving or are moving out. And so there's going to be some churn, some change in the neighborhood. And part of what we're interested in is, if we're going to preserve the identity of the neighborhood, is allowing people to continue to access the neighborhood, right? And so it's not just displacement in the sense of someone's rent increased and they had to move out, but it's also thinking about, they had to move out, but was someone else of a similar background able to move into the neighborhood, or are they now excluded from the neighborhood? And so I think that's part of the dynamic that I was trying to get at, and this process of concerns about displacement. It's true, we are concerned about people who live there losing their home, but that's not the whole story, and maybe in some instances maybe not the most important one all the time. We also want to maintain the accessibility of the neighborhood for people who want to come into the neighborhood, or people who grow up there who want to remain in the neighborhood. I think that's another element that we have to add to it. So I don't know if that makes sense in terms of what you were asking me, but that's kind of the way I think about displacement and why we might be concerned about it when it comes to gentrification.
Yeah, that helps, and I do have several questions coming in now, so that's a good thing. I do, just to clarify my understanding there, it sounds like displacement is happening all the time. We tend to be most concerned when people are coming in who we don't want to come in or we didn't expect to come in to erase or change the culture that exists.
Right, I would agree with that point.
Okay. So here is, let's take a question. How does gentrification impact the social capital of neighborhoods, and what policy measures could be implemented to foster social capital?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I think of social capital, and hopefully this coincides with who the questioner is, the way they're thinking about it, I'm thinking about the bonds and connections that people in the community have with one another and how they're able to use those bonds to achieve things that are important to them, whether it's improving their local school or getting better police protection, and so forth. So I think gentrification can affect social capital in different ways. And I think the two young ladies who were debating this topic touched on this to some extent. So on the one hand, bringing in people who perhaps have more resources, they might have more money, more and better political connections, that could actually increase the social capital in the community because they have the resources to affect change in their neighborhood. And so that could be a benefit. It could help the community be able to achieve more than they otherwise would. They might have a better relationship with the police, right? Because perhaps they don't have that history of maltreatment from the police. So they're able to connect and communicate with the police in a way that perhaps another community that has been traumatized by the police in the past isn't able to. On the other hand, bringing in a different group of people, it could create friction and divisions, such as some of the examples I shared with you. You might be more likely to have differences in goals or objectives that people think are important for their community. So in that instance, gentrification could create more friction and actually undermine the existing social capital in the community, because now you have competing groups who don't necessarily share the same interests. So I think gentrification can both increase and decrease social capital in a community. In terms of public policy, what can be done, what many cities and local governments have attempted to do is to involve the community, for example, as part of the planning process, right? So as part of the planning process, any major planning initiative or even minor planning initiative, I was involved in my towns, I was on the local planning board, would require community residents it would require that we communicate what we were doing to community residents and give them an opportunity to voice their concerns. So that can be effective. It's not always effective because sometimes people just don't come to the meetings or what have you, but it does give an opportunity, right? And it does give a rationale for people to come together and to communicate and talk about what's important to them. We also had a process where we held charrettes, which are, like mini presentations that planners and designers often use. We did that in neighborhoods around our town, right? So again, it was an opportunity for people to come together, to connect with one another, and hopefully build up some of the social capital in the community. Some cities have also experimented with participatory budgeting, right? So cities or towns have a discretionary budget, and rather than the elected officials deciding how to spend it, they would actually, have a hearing, have a community group meeting, and say, how do you all want to spend this money? Again, it gives people an opportunity to come together, connect with one another, and think about what's important to them. And ideally, that would be something that would carry over into the community and enhance the social capital that's there.
Okay, thank you. A question, I believe you wrote an article a few years ago about gentrification, that many people think that when those are displaced, that people go to areas where they are in worse conditions. And so could you talk to that question of, do people go to worse conditions typically?
Yeah, so someone's been digging in the crate, so to speak, to find things I've written in the past. That's interesting. So that's an important question. So what happens when people do leave gentrifying neighborhoods? So in general, what I have seen in the data that I have looked at, the types of neighborhoods that they move to are similar to the types of neighborhood that people leaving other neighborhoods move to. So if you compare a gentrifying neighborhood to another neighborhood that's starting out relatively poor or low income, they're both moving to the same types of neighborhoods, which would tend to be poorer neighborhoods than the gentrifying neighborhoods, but not necessarily poorer than the types of neighborhoods that other people are moving to, if that makes sense. Right? So you have people, I see you, I'll say that maybe a different way. So people are moving from a gentrifying neighborhood, but people are moving from other neighborhoods too, right? Mm-hmm. So if you compare the people leaving the gentrifying neighborhood, they're moving to the same types of neighborhoods as people moving from other neighborhoods. That part makes sense? They're both moving, say, to neighborhood A. The people coming from a gentrifying neighborhood and the people coming from the non-gentrifying neighborhood. They're both moving to neighborhood A. Now, neighborhood A is perhaps not as affluent or has less resources than the gentrifying neighborhood. Okay, so kind of depends on what you're comparing them to. You're comparing them to where they're leaving, or are you comparing them to other people who are also moving?
Okay, so I understand that they're moving and that there are lots of people moving to different areas. I wasn't sure if the research was indicating that they moved to what the presumption was, that they moved to poorer neighborhoods, or equivalent, or just different.
Well, poorer than what?
Poorer than the gentrified neighborhood from which they left.
Okay. Yeah, well, poorer than the neighborhood after it has experienced gentrification, but not necessarily poorer than it was before it experienced gentrification.
Okay, now that, I followed that one completely. Okay. Okay, Harlem, I'm going to read a question that came in. Harlem seems like a unique city. Are there places Tulsa should look to as an example for the path forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is my first time in Tulsa. So, but I do think there are some, obviously, cities. New York is the largest city in the country, but I do think there are other cities that are smaller that have also experienced, that are going through some of the similar transitions, places, and some, I think Tulsa can also learn from places that perhaps have not been so successful. Places that I have visited recently that I think have not been so successful would include Seattle and Washington. When I say not successful, in the sense that the black community really hasn't maintained its sort of cultural legacy. I mean, they have a few landmarks or markers, but it doesn't really have that sort of a black identity. Parts of Oakland would be another example, I think, maybe hasn't been as successful. Of course, you're asking me, though, for successful examples. Harlem has had some success. I think, probably Chicago is probably also not seen as maybe too large to compare to, I would guess, right? Although I think parts of the south side of Chicago have had some success. I think some parts of Philadelphia also have had some success in terms of maintaining their identity, even as the neighborhood starts to experience gentrification. But I do think, even with Harlem being relatively unique, I think there are lessons that can be taken away from that. That uniqueness cuts both ways in the sense that Harlem also had a lot of gentrification pressure on it, right? It shares the island with some of the richest neighborhoods in the world, and so it both is unique in terms of having a really extraordinary history, but also facing some extraordinary threats from gentrification because of it. So I still think there could be lessons to distill from it, even though it is somewhat unique in many ways.
Okay. I have a question from, and I'm going to provide a little more context to it because I think it actually really is an insightful one. My church is located in the Forest Orchard neighborhood, and the submitter indicates we're focusing on a neighborhood association, and they're asking this question about, do you think that's a good idea? And they provide this aspect of it that I think really stands out. The community is 72% rental. And so does that make a good neighborhood association to have those who are renting?
So you're asking, should the renters be part of the neighborhood association?
No. Is forming a neighborhood association in a community that is 72% rental a good idea?
Oh, yeah, I still think it could be a great idea. And in some ways, one could argue it's even more important when you have a lot of renters. Renters sometimes are overlooked in these processes. I was visiting a town in Louisville, Kentucky, and they were redoing their planning process. And one of the questions that comes up is that, as I mentioned in the case of New York and other cities, when the city undertakes a major initiative, property owners, neighbors are notified, but only if they own property, right? So only if you own property and you're adjacent to the new development are you notified. If you're a renter, you're not notified, right? And they might notify your landlord. And so what's that saying? That's saying that if you're a renter, we don't really care what you have to say about, we're going to build a new stadium next to your house, or we're going to tear down, the school or whatever. We're not even going to notify you because you're a renter. So I think renters are oftentimes overlooked, but they can be an important resource, and I think it makes sense, particularly in a neighborhood where they're the majority of the community, right? Excluding them would be excluding the majority of the people. So I would say in some regards it's perhaps even more important if you have predominantly renters to involve them in the community organizing process, whether it's through a neighborhood association or some other means.
Okay. And I have been told that I'm at time. I have to do my last question for you. So, looking back on your body of work and even your presentation for this evening, what's something that surprised you or shifted your thinking about cities and people?
Well, the research I've done on gentrification has actually surprised me, to be honest. I think I came into it with a set of assumptions and preconceptions, having grown up in New York, and those were primarily around the things that many of us hear about, the displacement. Sometimes it's presented in racial terms. It's just, white people coming into a black community and displacing the blacks. But I think it's more nuanced than that. In some instances, I've seen black people are the ones gentrifying the neighborhood. I've seen people have mixed feelings about what it means to them, even the people who live in the community. So I've come away with a more nuanced perception of what gentrification actually means. That's probably been the biggest surprise for me in the work that I've done, both as a practitioner, planner, and as an academic as well.
Thank you. And I do have to give you an opportunity to, if you have a suggestion for generations or next generations, because that seems to be part of your messaging. What would be your last statement to them?
Oh, great question. I mean, I would just say I see one of the students still here. Keep up the good work. I think you're doing a great job. I think engaging with these topics is important. What's really going to be important for Tulsa going forward is what people like the young students think, not what I think. And so I think they should continue to learn about what's happening in their communities, and we should do everything we can to give them the opportunity to speak and participate like what was done here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freeman, for that enlightening conversation. And Dr. Dickens, thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. You are our lifeblood, our supporters. And I'd also like to, again, thank our sponsors and especially the staff. Thank you, Vanessa Adams-Harris and Stephanie Vanderpool and Donna Gaskin and the wonderful Ruben Gant as well, our executive director. Please also remember to open up and scan the QR code on the first page and fill out our survey so we can get feedback. We always like hearing from our audience members so we can continue to learn and improve the programming from here on out, which brings to mind our next symposium speaker is arriving and will be speaking in May, on May 29th, 2025, and that is Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly from UCLA. So please join us again in May, and thank you again. Have a safe drive home. Yeah, and remember to buy some books and get them signed.